Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us this morning for our Friday Forum for February. This morning we've got a great presentation from David Kellershohn from the City of Toronto. This is actually the second time that we've had staff from the City of Toronto in to talk about their flood risk reduction. We had Michael DeAndre in quite a few years ago after the 2005 storm, so we thought it would be good to get an update because we know there's lots of great work going on in the City of Toronto that would be of interest to both governments and insurers that tend to attend the webinars. So the presentation will be roughly an hour. We have a few people in the boardroom with us that will perhaps interrupt during the webinar and ask questions. For those of you online, you'll be able to submit questions using the question box. You might have heard Tracy mention that a few minutes ago. To access the box, just look in the panel that comes up automatically when you've logged into the webinar and expand the question chat option. And if you type your questions in, we'll receive them and we'll keep track of them, and we'll have them on hand to ask at the end of the webinar. Before I hand it over to David Kellershohn, I will just remind you that our next webinar is March 11th. Feel free also to come into the office and attend in person or join online. And we'll have Professor Simonovic in talking about climate change and flood risk management. And with that, I'll pass it to David.
Thanks, Dan. So once again, I'm David Kellershohn. I'm Manager of Stormwater Management for Toronto Water with the City of Toronto, and I'm here also with Graham Harding, the Director of that same group. And we're here to talk to you about our program for about an hour or so, and please give us any questions you may have, and we can answer them afterwards. So I'm going to figure out how to advance the slides. And I'm going to start with basically an overview of what I wanted to talk about today. So a little bit of overview of program history. So a little bit of background. Some of you may have heard it before, but I think it's important for setting the stage. I'm going to go over the city strategy, all the different parts of it for basement flooding protection. I'm going to tell you about what's new since we last spoke. Dan said one of my predecessors, Michael DeAndre, came and spoke a few years ago, so I want to tell you what's happened since that time. A little bit of in the works, so these are things that we're working on that may come to be, just so we can see what's on the horizon, at least the way we see the horizon. And then I'll recap with a little bit of a summary. So to start off with, I wanted to paint how I fit in the city, or how this group fits in the city as a structure. So we have the City of Toronto, the big organization that tries to do everything, and it has a set of strategic actions. From that strategic actions, Toronto Water, which is one of the divisions in the City of Toronto, comes up with its own strategic plan. And it tries to do a number of things, but we're a little bit about, as you can see there in some of the print, service excellence, committed to improvement, and some of these things help us form the basement flooding program, or help us improve the basement flooding program over time. So we created the wet weather flow master plan, and that plan had 13 key objectives. One of those objectives focused on reduction of flooding, particularly basement flooding or urban flooding. And so out of that, we now have what we call the basement flooding protection program, which is one of those objectives in that larger plan. And so a little bit more detailed. So with respect to Toronto Water, so we have a mission statement, because Toronto Water tries to do a large number of things, and I'll just quickly read it. To provide water quality services through supplying drinking water and the treatment of wastewater and stormwater to residents, businesses, and visitors in order to protect public health, safety, and property in an environmentally and fiscally responsible manner. So the basement flooding protection program fits really well with that, with public health, safety, property, and in an environmentally and fiscally responsible manner. And then we have some guiding principles below that, which allow us to keep improving the program and try to be the best at what we do. So continuous service delivery improvement, so that's why you'll see program changes over time. And number 2, we're getting better at spending our money. Number 3, operational excellence. So we want to operate what we build really well. And we have infrastructure management and employer of choice as parts of our plan. So Toronto Water is fairly large. We serve over 3.4 million residents. So we have people in Toronto, we have people in York and Peel with respect to the water supply that we provide. We have more than 28.3 billion in infrastructure assets, over 10,700 kilometers of storm, sanitary, and combined sewers. And another key thing for us is that we're 100% rate supported. So our water rate funds all of the work we do, including the Basin Flooding Protection Program. So that doesn't come out of the tax base. Because we're so large, because we're trying to do so many things, that brings in some challenges with competing interests. So one of the things we have is the city's getting older. So we have an aging infrastructure backlog. We call it our state of good repair backlog at about $1.6 billion now. We also have a lot of growth in the City of Toronto, so how do we also upgrade our systems to handle population growth? We have increasing environmental goals, so environmental stewardship, so water quality, our rivers, our lakes, but also for our residents. And we also have climate change as a factor influencing our decisions and influencing the level of urban flooding. So I want to jump into why did we create the Basin Flooding Protection Program, and I think that's an important question when we look at ourselves as a city. Why do we have that? And it really comes down to we've had a number of large storms over the last 15 or so years, and the number of those storms, the magnitude of those storms, created enough impacts that now we have an interest in improving our systems so that so our residents, our businesses have fewer impacts. And really it started more or less around May 12, 2000. We had a storm event then. It was a big storm event. It wasn't bigger than the more recent ones, but it was the start of the change for us to spend more money on resolving the problem and also trying to change our service standards. So moving from the way we used to build things to a bigger standard for better risk reduction. So we did a number of studies, and we had some movement after May 2000, and then we had August 19th, 2005, very large storm, a lot of impacts to residents and a lot of impacts to city infrastructure. And then we basically put our foot on the gas pedal, made the program bigger, and enhanced our service standards more. And then we had a couple more storm events that really reinforced our momentum or increased our momentum. So I'll go a little bit over just very quickly what the storm events were. So May 12, 2000, it was spread out a little bit more over the city, a little bit greater intensity in the north half of the city, perhaps a little bit west of Yonge. We felt some impacts a little bit greater on that side of the city. But there were a fair number of basin floodings, so that started our current program. August 19th, 2005 is really where we created a staff report to council, and we came up with the title, Basin Flooding Protection Program. It was a tremendous storm. We had flash floods of rivers and ravines and watercourses. Stream banks overflowed. That had a lot of impacts to residents, to transportation. We had lots of erosion along our watercourses, lots of damage to public and private property, and we had lots of sewer backups. This storm primarily across the north half of the city, and whereas the south half of the city really didn't feel a lot. It rained, but the impacts were primarily north of 401. And we had several rain gauges record greater than 100-year return period storm event. Those are the red circles on the slide. So one of the pictures probably many of you have seen, but we had a catastrophic failure at Finch Avenue. And there we go. So I have a few different pictures as the event is happening and washing away Finch Avenue. and the infrastructure, lost a fair amount of infrastructure under the road with it as well. So that failure took a long time to repair. So that was a driver for us as a city. How do we better manage our infrastructure so that we can ensure transportation systems even during a large storm event? These are some impacts felt across the city. So this is Steeles Avenue. So a lot of cars floating on the road. That would impact the business and buildings beside the roads as well. This is a video I wanted to show you of Birkdale Ravine. So this is something we will experience in our water courses.
Holy crap! Oh, that was worth the wait! Did you see that? Oh,
So,
it's barbecue with the deers! Oh, what you gonna do for Christmas? Oh my God!
so I'm not sure why he's talking about Christmas, but so what happens there is that's somebody's backyard, a tree in someone's backyard being washed into the water course into the ravine. So it's definitely a big issue for our residents and businesses. Most cases, thankfully, it's been backyards and not buildings. But in the worst case scenario, that can approach the buildings. So August 19th, 2005, we had one of our major trunk sewers, the Highland Creek sanitary trunk sewer, lost in that storm event. Storm event came through, water levels in Highland Creek rose dramatically. Downstream at the treatment plant, they started noticing tree trunks and other large items showing up at the treatment plant. But because of the water levels in the Highland Creek, it was a couple days before we were able to find where the break was when the water course levels dropped. And so that ended up having to do emergency repairs. We basically created a channel where the sewer used to be, and the sewage flowed in the open until we could install a new pipe. But that's a tremendous health impact in terms of sewage flowing in the water course for quite a while. So we have our traditional toilet overflowing picture, basement flooding damages, which unfortunately happens during these large storm events. And this is a snapshot of the basement flooding complaints that the city receives through its 311 call center following that storm event. So you can see the black dots primarily north of the 401, some south, but that really is where we felt the impact. So we had over 4,200 calls. So busily working away, created the program after 2005, and then 2013 happened. So very large storm event as well. Similar magnitude in terms of basement floodings, a little bit greater. We had 4,700 reported basement floodings to the city's call center. But a little bit different this time. We had many more, so I'll call them backyard impacts, what I'm calling erosion sites on the slide. So over 450 properties losing some portion of their property into the water courses. And another thing in this storm event versus the 2005 storm event, we lost one of the transformer stations was lost. It was down for a while. So we had over 300,000 properties without power. So what we had was floodings during the storm event itself, but then also we had floodings 12 or more hours later as the water basically seeped into the basements. So a little bit different flooding, but still damage. And this shows how the rainfall fell across that storm event. So you can see the red dots more on the west side of the city. The circled one is where we had the worst, the rain gauge that recorded the most amount of rain, 138 millimeters. And so this hit a different part of the city, which taught us a few things about trying to be more proactive rather than reactive to storm events, because the next storm can hit differently than the previous storm. And the other thing on the right side of the slide, we just graphed out the relative amount of rainfall that fell over 3 hours between the storm events. So, because sometimes people will say this storm event was much worse than that storm event, I think we always have to be careful when we say that, because we have to ask ourselves, was it more intense? Was it longer? What was the volume? We need to answer all of these questions to say which storm was worse. Perhaps it's easier to say which impacts were worse.
It always gets compared to Hazel, right? So how do these storms compare to Hazel in terms of time, amount of rain and time?
So the best analogy we have for how does it compare to Hazel is that these storm events were, I hate to say it, but much smaller. Hurricane Hazel was a very long storm event, so it didn't have the peak intensity that these storm events had, but because it was such a long storm event, what was felt in the watercourses downstream where they were flowing into the lakes was 3 to 4 times the volume of water in the watercourses than what these storms produced. So, and that's why in Hurricane Hazel actually homes washed away, not just little slivers of backyards. So let's go back one. So I want to jump into our strategy for what we're doing. So we're trying to solve the problem in a bunch of different ways. We're spending the lion's share on infrastructure projects, but we actually have a multi-pronged approach at the strategy. So we're trying to reduce the risk as quickly as possible for as many residents as possible. We're trying to minimize the creation of new risks. So as the city grows and builds, what are we doing with our policies and guidelines to try and reduce that new build or to have those new builds have a lower risk profile than the previous ones? And we also have a whole emergency planning process because sometimes we can't stop it from raining, but are we ready to bounce back quickly is we need to be part of that as well. So using that same circle I had on the previous slide, and this follows a little bit of an asset management life cycle approach where on this circle we show starting with planning near the top and working our way around. We have planning, then implementing, operating, but also evaluating and then preparing for next time. And what I've put on the slide in the black on the outside is how the various parts of our program fit into those various phases of asset management. So under planning, we're doing capacity studies, trying to understand our system better, trying to understand those bottlenecks so we can work on them. We have project prioritization. It's going to be really costly for us to build everything. It's going to take time. So how do we choose which projects we do first? And we have our policy development, which I loosely use those words, but that could be anything from our design standards to zoning bylaws, whole package of things that we need to think about and plan for the long term. On implementing, now we're into construction, so let's put in, one example would be bigger sewers to try and manage that water better. We also have subsidy programs, so that speaks to trying to encourage homeowners to do some implementation on their side of the property line. And we have a downspout disconnection bylaw, which I've thrown in to implement because that's changing something on the private side as well. We have operating. We have our system, so even if we're not upgrading our system, how can we make that the best? And the best way to do that is we got to keep a good close eye on it. So we got to inspect it to understand where those sewers are getting dirty or clogged. Then we got to do maintenance to clean them, repair them, because that'll maintain our capacity that we have today so we don't lose it over time. And we'll couple that with some monitoring to understand our system. On the evaluation side, one of the things that we've built into the program is, okay, so we've built a sewer, we think it will achieve this level of service, but how do we know? So we're built in flow monitoring basically to confirm that we're meeting those service targets, hopefully before that storm event happens, so we don't just have angry residents that say, oops, you missed, but we know and we can address it beforehand. And we have customer service. Many questions from many different directions, but those allow us to think about either our policies or specific homes and neighborhoods and use to build into our next steps. And preparing, so emergency planning and education and outreach, so getting ready for the next time. So infrastructure upgrades is what I'll talk about first here. So we really started that framework in the program in 2006, and we started that with capacity studies, and we did it on a focused portion of the city because of how the storm events hit us before. But in 2013, we wanted to stop chasing the storms, and we wanted to have a citywide approach. So the program became expanded citywide. So now our goal is infrastructure upgrades or service improvements across the whole city. So it's a multi-year program. It's going to take us many years to do all the parts. It's the capacity studies are following the municipal class EA process. And there's a few reasons we do that. Number one, we really want to engage with the public. We get a lot of information from them when we do. And it really helps us focus our solutions. And the big part is the enhanced design standards that we have. So we still have the May 2000 storm standard, and that one was introduced after the May 2000 storm, and that's for the sanitary sewer system. And on the storm drainage systems, which would include the combined sewer systems as well, we're aiming towards the 100-year storm event design standard. So I mentioned that we moved to a citywide approach. So what this map shows is the city with primarily two colors on it, but purple being future EA studies and the beige being either completed or ongoing EA studies. So we cut up the city into 67 study areas, and we're marching through the city to try and do capacity assessments for each of those studies and then move into infrastructure implementation. So far we've completed studies for 26 of the areas, and we have about 14 or 15 ongoing right now at this time. Yeah. So jumping into the capacity assessments is really our first step in that process. We're using InfoWorks modeling to model the surface flows and the underground flows. So we're modeling the storm systems and the sanitary systems. And we're doing it in a very detailed way. So it's manhole to manhole, catch basin to catch basin, trying to understand where our bottlenecks are in a neighborhood, either in the sewer systems or on the road surface. And what we're doing to make sure that we understand all of that correctly is we're calibrating and validating those models. We're calibrating the models with sewer flow monitoring data that we're taking at the beginning step of that study. And then we're validating using all the calls that we come in into us. And we've even added another point where when we do the studies, we have questionnaires filled out by the residents. So we're verifying those facts that we got from the phone calls after the rain events to validate our modeling.
Sorry, Dave, to interrupt. We just had a question from somebody online, which might be good for clarification, but could you describe what an EA is, EA process? And
Sure. So the EA process, EA standing for Environmental Assessment Process, is something that came out through Municipal Engineers Association, and it sets a framework by which if you wanted to analyze a system and if you wanted to recommend improvements to it, it creates a process or an order of steps whereby you consult with the public at a number of points in time, and it also has some rules about how you would document that process. So it gives the public an opportunity through public meetings to comment on what you're doing, and through the documentation, it gives the public an opportunity to review the documentation. So the interesting part about that process is for very complex projects, you really need to do that process. For simpler projects, let's say we want to build a sewer within a right-of-way, we don't have to follow that Class EA process. In a sense, all we need to do is notify the public that we're doing something. But we've decided on this program to, regardless of what kind of project, do all of this primarily for that public input to get that feedback. So hopefully that answers the question. And so fast forward. So I have another slide on the capacity assessment here. One of the challenges with the detailed approach, each study takes 2 to 3 years to complete. We're building models that we didn't have before. where there's some field verification, there's some flow monitoring, that takes time, the public process takes some time, the documentation takes time, so we're at 2 to 3 years. We feel it's worthwhile in terms, because it allows us to identify on sewer by sewer changes that we might want to make. So, and what we also do on the last bullet there is we can run a bunch of different scenarios. So we can run different storm events, but we can also run different types of upgrades to that neighborhood, see how that benefits the neighborhood, and that really helps us choose the best solution. So we do these studies, we do the scenario analysis, we come up with a bunch of preferred recommendations to resolve I'll just loosely say, the bottlenecks in our system. And what we end up with is a long list of projects. Some of them very expensive, some of them cheaper, and we need to figure out a way to prioritize them. And the way we've come to this is on a yearly basis, we report to City Council as part of the Toronto Water budget process what our 5-year list of projects is planned to be. And we prioritize our efforts through a couple of principles, and they're highlighted in blue on this slide. So number one, the study principle. So this is when we do those EA studies, those capacity assessment studies. We study the city in order of decreasing density of flooding complaints. So we have 67 study areas. How do we decide which study area to do next? We do it based on the number of phone calls we've received from residents and the number of phone calls across the spectrum of storm events. So it's not from one storm event. It's basically we've taken all the calls we've gotten since 2000 on any storm event greater than a 25-year return period. So what that does is if you have a home that flooded several times, that density of that neighborhood of flooding increases, and then hence we study that first. On the implementation principle, the third bullet there, we implement projects that benefit the most properties at the lowest cost first. And that was the principle we landed on because we wanted to get as many homes as possible, as quickly as possible, to that enhanced level of service as quickly as possible. But we also had to add on another rule, because even with that, the volume was so big in relation to the budget that we had available. We still had to think about, are some projects too expensive? Should those happen first or second or later? So we have the fourth bullet, which is all of our projects we're doing now, almost all of our projects now, are less than $32,000 per benefiting property as a cost for that upgrade. So that's not saying that we won't do those other projects, it's just saying we're in a sense doing the cheaper projects first. Cheaper products first. So a few pictures, the works we've been doing. So construction works started for us in 2009 under this program. This is a residential neighborhood in North York, 3.6 meter wide box culvert. In order to fit that under the road, nobody's driving to their house on that while we're working. So we have to arrange parking nearby. It's quite disruptive, but it also goes to show that there are some physical limits to how big a sewer we can put under the ground. And that's probably one challenge that I'll highlight later. So to date, we've spent $237 million since the end of 2009 in infrastructure upgrades. And that's to the end of 2015. So some other images in terms of that sewer where the two people are standing in, that's a 2.7 meter diameter storm sewer. That went in one residential neighborhood. That one project alone was about $30 million. We've built a tank in Old Shepherd Park. Sits underneath the park. And the part I always find humorous, we also built a toboggan hill on top of it because that was the cost of doing business for building in a park. But it's a 12,000 cubic meter tank. It's a storm water tank. Basically, once the level in the sewer rises to a certain amount, it flows into this tank, gets held in this tank, and there's a number of sensors in the system. Pumps would discharge the tank after the storm event has passed. We also do surface ponds in parks primarily. These could be dry ponds, so on the bottom picture there's some soccer posts. It was taken during a rain event, so you can see the water in it. But that's meant to take those flows there, so before they would get into somebody's basements. So that's set at elevations lower than the basements. Wanted to highlight our watercourse improvements. So it's not something we often think about when we think about basin flooding protection, but it is an impact for the city from large storm events. So we do a couple of things. We have a planned approach and we have call it an emergency approach. This slide here shows a planned approach. We had a bunch of erosion on Humber Creek. The banks of the watercourse were slumping away. Once those banks slump away, then the strength of those banks weaken, so we don't want that. So on the right side there, through planned works, we've reworked that watercourse, and now when that storm event comes, it should be much more capable of handling larger flows without eroding. So here's a slightly different picture, not as pretty, on the top left. That's a sanitary trunk manhole and what we call Berry Creek. So this was discovered through, we work with the Toronto Region Conservation Authority to inspect all of the watercourses throughout the city. So they have staff every year, they walk along all the watercourses and they document what they find. And we use that with them to build a capital plan to resolve that. And what happened here is, and it's happening across the city, all the watercourses, almost all of the watercourses are down cutting. Because of all the impacts of development on that flow regime, they're down cutting and they're exposing our infrastructure, and we have to come in and armor it and protect it. This is, you got to call it watercourse is public infrastructure still. So these are smaller sewers. The top one there is Wilkett Creek. That location is a small sanitary sewer. That's entirely within private property. So that one, that rather wealthy gentleman owns, surprisingly in Toronto, quite a few acres of property that we had to negotiate with to get that. But what's happened here is the watercourse is down cut. You see a line in the picture there, which is the sewer. On the downstream side of that sewer, a person could not stand. We have to send divers in on the downstream side. On the upstream side, maybe it went up to halfway between your ankles and your knees. So the watercourse undercuts that. It's gradual. We need to plan for that. The picture on the bottom was after the 2013 storm event. So that used to be in the bank beside the watercourse. Watercourse eroded the bank, and we lost that sewer.
So that sewer in the bottom picture there would have been discharging into the watercourse for a while?
That's correct.
Okay. Is it still common to build sewer, sanitary sewers underneath watercourses like that, or is there, what's the, the standard in terms of depth below the bottom of the watercourse?
So every municipality sets its own standards. So I definitely know that the requirements have become much more strict. So I joined the city about 6 or 7 years ago. Prior to that, we tried to get, I built subdivisions and we put them 1.2, 1.5 meters. Maybe we're lucky to get them 2 meters below, but based on the rate of downcutting, that's not sufficient.
Right.
In Toronto, we're not building new sewers across. We might have to take a trunk sewer and redo it, but we're not putting new ones under. We're trying to get them under our streets. They're much more accessible and, in a sense, safer. So one key thing about these kinds of things, from a budgeting or planning point of view, they're very unpredictable. The top one, very gradual, but one storm event can drastically change those conditions. So that's a challenge for us for planning where we need to do those upgrades. So we start to get into private property impacts. So maybe Toronto Water doesn't care as much about this because there's no sewer there, no water main there. However, there's somebody's backyard. You can see the retaining walls being exposed. And if nothing's done, that backyard will be lost. So it's a real challenge for the city because those interactions between private property and the watercourse, sometimes in private ownership, sometimes in city ownership. And so how do we to fix them, or how do we encourage the homeowner to fix them is a big challenge. And we always have to go back to what's the most important. So public health and safety, most important. So where a structure, a house, a building is at risk, we will come in and fix it, but where those risks aren't in place, have to wait longer, unfortunately. So here's a few more images of, on the top picture, a building that's not that far away from being at risk. On the bottom picture, this is where we've come in, put in armor stone, repaired it, and so it looks really good, looks really solid. The sad part is, even with that size stone and the 2013 event, we had size that stone that size moving downstream in our water courses. So it's a challenge between how big a stone can you find and what's reasonable.
Sorry to interrupt again. So that $32,000 threshold per property, is that also factored in for erosion protection, or is that
So it is not.
Okay.
So we deal with our watercourse erosion through a separate budget process. The catch with it is, and I'll get to the money on the infrastructure side, but I'll quickly highlight infrastructure money. We're trying to get to 160 million in expenditures per year. Watercourse erosion, we're at 7 million. So there's quite a different magnitude. So what we try to do is, where private property is in, we have a policy to share that cost with a private property owner. If we're not sharing the cost, we'll only do the work if that land is transferred into public ownership, so we can maintain those and watch those for time. But so the way on the watercourse side is $7 million. What can we do with that? And what ends up happening is you have a long list and a long backlog. And that's why the bottom bullet there, 10 plus years to complete. So I did mention operations and maintenance before. So we have a CCTV program, which is a closed circuit television program. So they're running cameras through all of our sewers to where, looking for blockages, debris, breaks, all kinds of things. And we use that to just fix the system we have, even if we're not making it bigger. The volume at which we're cameraing the sewers has more than doubled in the last 4 years. So we're doing over 500 kilometers a year in the city of Toronto for that now. So when we do find things, we have a cleaning and flushing program. Right now our rules say on sanitary and combined sewers, once every 5 years, we're going to clean and flush that sewer. Storm sewers, however, because they're less prone to collecting debris, it's more as required. So as we see things, or as we're aware of things, they'll be cleaned. The strange part about this, though, is we say we're going to clean all sewers once every 5 years. There are a lot of sewers in the city that never need cleaning. They have a nice slope. They don't get a lot of stuff in them. So we're actually moving towards changing those rules, whereby our program is going to be focused on here where we're having problems. That's where we're going to clean and flush. The ones where we've never had problems and we never see problems, let's not clean a sewer. So we'll change the rules a bit to allow us to do that. Grease. So bullet number 3, education and outreach on grease disposal. That's a tough one for us. Once that grease gets in that sewer, it is really, really tough to get out. Flushing removes some, but I don't think we should be left with the illusion that it removes all. A very mechanical process is required to remove it all, but what the grease does is it steals that capacity from that sewer, from the drainage system, and it's like in your arteries, a silent killer. It creeps up on you. And we have environmental compliance monitoring. So I'll just say that's trying to keep everybody honest with how much they're putting in and how clean it is, what they're putting in our sewer system. So we have that program.
Lots of talk about flushable wipes. Are you having big problems with flushable wipes in the city?
So we are. I'm not sure the exact magnitude in terms of dollars, but it's on our radar as well. So the first, on the top there, the bluish slide speaks to what not to flush down, flush or pour down drains, flushable wipes. I think it is on there somewhere. It is on there somewhere. So those are, on the right side, those are two sorts of pamphlets that select neighborhoods will receive or will have at public meetings or other venues for residents to see. So in the City of Toronto, we also have this issue between a public and private property. So it's very easy for Toronto Water to fix its sewers. It's much harder for Toronto Water to fix somebody else's sewers. So how do we do that? So we have this incentive program to try and encourage homeowners to upgrade their systems or watch their systems on their side. And we're trying to cover a lot of the cost of that to try and make it easy to do that. And that speaks towards our private property incentives. So we have up to $3,400 per property for things such as a backwater valve, so a maximum of $1,250 to install that for your sanitary connection. To install a sump pump, we have $1,750. So the primary goal there is you're taking your foundation drainage and ideally discharging it to the surface where it can infiltrate and reduce the load on the sewer system. And the sump pump really goes with the third bullet, disconnection of a home's foundation drains from the sewer system. Those two together work best. So far, over 16,500 applications have been processed, and we've paid out over $27 million in subsidies to homeowners. So interesting things about that, every storm event, our application rate increases. It drops off a little bit after the storm event, but if we look 6, 8 months or a year after the storm event, our application rate is always greater than. So it goes up and it doesn't really come back down. So on our next slide, we have our mandatory downspout disconnection program. So this is a bylaw that is being phased in across the city. So we have 3 aspects to it, ranging from November 20th, 2011 to December 3rd, 2016. And that really speaks to different types of properties in the city. One's in the combined sewer area, one in what we call basin flooding areas, which has now been, funny enough, expanded to the whole city. And the third one being for properties outside the basin flooding area and combined sewer service area. So that's the end of this year. So we're hoping to get those disconnections because a lot of those homes that are connected, there was a standard practice for building homes in the city whereby those foundation drain systems and downspouts drained into our sanitary system. If we get rid of that roof drainage, that's a huge benefit even if we're not changing a pipe on our system. So moving on with bylaws, we try to work with other divisions to influence how new developments or new properties are built in the city. So the first part here are citywide zoning bylaws, so that's through our planning division. Reverse slope driveways. There's a lot of them in the city. We don't build as many. Unfortunately, there's still the odd one that gets built because there are ways around in the courts and whatnot. But through that bylaw, they're no longer permitted because that's a big risk factor. The other one I highlighted was maximum lot coverage values. I can see that being a little bit weak at times, but that's important when we link it with our downspout disconnection program. If you don't have a yard to send your downspouts to, ultimately it's still going to come back into the sewer system. So that lot coverage is important as well. We have our sewers bylaw, which is the second bullet there, which says no new connections to storm sewers from private property. So that's our blanket approach. So that's what we expect from developments. There is a process by which, for various physical reasons, there is no place on the surface to send the water. For example, it might create ice across the sidewalk, whereby you still can connect to the sewer system, but that process is a bit long-winded and for obvious reasons. The last bullet, through a council report, we declared the entire city at risk of flooding. So we got around the issue of installing backwater valves in some new homes and not others. No, the whole city's at risk, therefore any building in the city must have. That's how we got around that. Our education outreach program every year grows, and it's multi-pronged as well. So we have advertisement campaigns. So we have print ads, so newspapers, etc. Might be local newspapers, might be bigger newspapers. Targeted web ads, so those might show up here and there on various sites. And we have posters in TTC shelters. And so the poster there is one of the posters that we had put up in TTC shelters in the past. We have brochures. Our latest one called Managing Water Around the House from A to Z. That's really an education piece. Explains a lot of things about a person's home and how they're connected. We have and those brochures, every opportunity we can, whatever public meetings, we can hand those out. We have our City of Toronto website where we have some information about what we're doing and what our programs are. We also do have a social media campaign, and so it's along the lines of it's the fall, and we'll tweet out messages. Don't forget to clean the leaves out of your eaves trough, or please call us if there's leaves on your catch basin grates on the street. So little reminders to have people thinking, oh, it's that time of year, I'd have to think about this or that. And construction notices. When we're working in a neighborhood, everybody gets 2 notices, a public notice, which maybe be 1 to 2 months ahead of the construction, and a second notice 2 weeks ahead. Great opportunities for us to tell them about everything, even lead water service replacement. We bundle into basin flooding. So this is our Managing Water Around the House brochure. So it's new. For 2015 is created, and it's a fold-out. So the big picture there is the internal fold-out. Has all kinds of little labels to speak about different components of a house and things you might want to consider or watch for around your house to manage your water. So this gentleman's name is Shaka. He's been our field ambassador since day one, since 2009. He's still a field ambassador for us. It was an experiment that we tried, and it's basically we hire a contractor to go build things, and what happens is there's a lot of disruption, and sometimes residents get upset. And then, yes, there's a phone number on a board, but it's not the most helpful. Well, Shaka goes out and he knocks on every door, and so he is a bridge for us, but for managing all deficiencies on the site. It has tremendously reduced the number of calls, complaints, issues we've had on our construction sites because he can deal with it right on site. And so that's one really big thing for us in working with the community that's been a success. We have construction notices and signage. So the blue there in the middle is the sign that you'll see around our construction projects. And on select projects, we'll have community meetings. And I say select projects, so for example, if we're doing something in a park, we're going to have a community meeting because that impacts a lot of people. We're less likely to have a community meeting if we're putting in a storm sewer under a road. There's less to talk about in a sense. And I mentioned the Toboggan Hill earlier. That came out of a community meeting for that project. The park started out flat. It's made out of styrofoam. So.
You said made out of styrofoam?
So when we built the tank, it was designed for a certain load of soil on top. We couldn't build a hill of soil on top without redesigning the tank. But if the core of the hill is made out of styrofoam and it has 1.5 meters of soil on top. So it made it a lot lighter. We didn't have to redesign the tank. But it was people always say, I go to these community meetings and you don't do anything. That's the example I use. Well, actually, it was a lot of grandparents lived in the area, and they brought the hill they needed was a short hill for 3-year-olds, and that's what they wanted, so that's what they got. So we do listen. So I want to talk to you about what's new in the program, what's changed over the last few years. So just a highlight, so I have bigger goals, so I want to do more. I have more resources, improved coordination, improved calibration and validation, and more experience. So this shows our budget for the Basement Flooding Protection Program. So the greenish colored bars was the 2013 approved capital budget. The blue is the 2016 approved capital budget. So you can see sort of starting 2017 and beyond, there's quite a bit of difference in the amount of money we want to spend on the program. And the money on this table here includes our construction works, our fees for the studies, includes the money for our subsidy program. It's all of those parts of that program. And the top there gives a quick summary. So 10-year capital plan a few years ago, about 900 million, 915 million. Now it's over 1.5 billion. It was really the 2013 storm that made the change for us. That's where council said more, faster. So we're trying to get to 160 million of construction money in about 3 or 4 years' time. We're currently at about 60 million a year now. So we can't get all those projects done without more people. So we have about 3 times as many internal staff between a number of divisions working on this from what we had back in 2012, 2013. A couple new hires, but a lot of it was reassigning staff from other groups because a big challenge for us is getting more people into the city. But we could, this is a priority, we could refocus and get the right people. And then we have what we call Basement Flooding 4, which is a number we've given to a contract. But Basement Flooding 1, 2, and 3, I'd say we're more like delivering projects. Basement Flooding 4 is more about delivering a program. So we said if we want to more than triple what we're doing, we have to change how we work. So the core of the contract is a program management team. They've been moved to Metro Hall, our offices, so 10 staff from a consulting firm, and they give us all this program management advice. So it's about economies of scale. It's about better tracking. It's about more resources where we couldn't hire people. The consulting industry can help us. So, but we needed to get some council authority to do that because what we wanted to do was have the consultants make some choices for us. So when we hire a contractor to build something, we were spending so much time managing those individual contracts. We needed council authority to have the consultants sign off on those invoices for us. So that's the first bullet there. In August 2014, City Council approved a program management capital delivery model. That was really the authority for consultants to do some things for us. So a little bit more about Basement Flooding 4. So capitalizing on economies of scale, we want to take it from individual projects to more like a factory. So how can we bundle like things together? So less administration, less of that paperwork, but more construction. We wanted to learn from people who have done this around. A number of major cities around the world have done very large programs. So a bunch of research, they said, if you want to do this model, you need to spend over $1 billion. Anything less than that, you don't really get any efficiencies out of this model. So we said, okay, Basement Flooding 4, we're going to target 10 years. We're going to try and spend over $1 billion. That made it large enough to attract the firms with the right people. So we have a couple of the people on the team have moved from abroad to Toronto in the last few months. So that's great stuff for us. The nice part about it is that bullet number 3, it's quickly scalable. So if we want to tomorrow do twice as much as what we did today, this program management team hires many consultants and many contractors. Whereas before we took more of a one consultant approach, and then we were limited by what that consulting firm could do. Now we're only limited by how many consulting firms there are on the planet. That's a bit stretching it, but which is good for us. City staff provide oversight and management of the program. So we're not there to watch every little step. It'll be more of an auditing function. So random selection of projects, we then come in, review anything from the designs or the financials or whatnot. But we're more about setting the rules with the program management team. And the long-term commitment, so it says 5-year contract with option to extend to 10 years. So that was us being conservative, the 5-year number. We said to ourselves, what if this doesn't work? So at year 5, we get a chance to assess and continue or change. Wanted to highlight improved coordination. So another thing that's happened, there are a number of little gaps in the city. So one gap that would exist is a homeowner has their backyard always being wet. So some people will quickly say that's a private property issue. However, there's an expectation that the city is there to do something to help with that, even if it's advice. So City Council said, all right, all of you divisions, we need a committee. We need you talking amongst each other. So on the third bullet there, membership includes city planning, engineering and construction services, municipal licensing and standards, so MLS, municipal licensing and standards. They tend to be the group that deals with a lot of these private property issues, but they need some better tools to give better solutions. And they can only do that by working with the rest of us to fill in all the gaps that we might have between our groups. So we do need to report back to City Council, and there are a number of items that we're addressing as a group. Improved calibration and validation. So better data equals greater confidence. One of the challenges with our detailed modeling that we do is that there's a lot of skeptics. Is that really the right size? Is that really going to solve the problem for those new sewers? So the only way we can be sure of that is we've increased the amount of flow monitoring we're doing ahead of those capacity assessments. In the past, we did one contract, hired one person, he did the flow monitoring, he did the modeling, he did the reporting. Now we've split it out, so the flow monitoring is separate. So we already have almost like a blanket flow monitoring contract, and we're continually doing flow monitoring. And now we're starting the studies as fast as we can start them, and we take that flow monitoring data and hand it over. So now instead of 3 or 4 months of data, we're getting 6 months, 8 months, a year or more of data, which will give us more confidence. The other component is we've built something. How can we be sure that it worked? So in select neighborhoods, we're putting in monitors afterwards, and those monitors, we will keep them in as long as we need to till we get that storm event that proves to us by comparing with the model that we've achieved what we want to. If we haven't achieved what we want to, then at least we can come in and try and fix the problem before that big storm event hits. And we have other problems. So I want to tell a little bit of a story. So $237 million construction upgrade so far. And for the most part, it's worked really well. However, this is a neighborhood where we upgraded the sewers in 2012. We spent over $30 million upgrading the sewers in that neighborhood. And then on August 4th and August 1st and August 4th, in 2014, a number of homes in that community flooded. So one of those storm events was between a 2-year and 5-year storm event. And if you remember, we targeted a 100-year storm event as our level of service. And even the other storm event, while a little bit larger, was still below what we targeted. So we really scratched our heads. People weren't happy. Councillor wasn't happy. Couldn't understand why it didn't work. So we said, okay, let's forget everything we've assumed. Let's throw this model out. Let's go to this neighborhood. Let's really find out what happened. And it's difficult to do on every neighborhood, so we don't do it on every neighborhood. But we learned a lot from this investigation. So first thing we did was we sent a questionnaire out we blanketed that community. So people that flooded, people that didn't flood. And so they first got a short questionnaire, which is more or less along the lines of, did you flood and can we talk to you? And the people who said, yes, we can talk to them. We then did either on the phone or we met with them in person, and we filled out a multi-page questionnaire to really drill down into how exactly did that water come in, what did it look like, where did it come from, how much, and also, you know, have them describe to us how their house looked in terms of plumbing, what they knew about it. So it really brought us to most of the answers to the questions we had. We also added in sewer flow monitoring, rainfall monitoring, and groundwater monitoring throughout the neighborhood to also understand. And it says topographic surveys. We surveyed the basement elevations for the homes that let us. So the picture there on the man holding a pipe that's full of mud, believe it or not, that was came out of a house that was built in the late 60s. It was an infill house in the neighborhood, so one of my guys happened to be there and he took a picture of it. So you can see how after only 40, 50 years, you can get a lot of sediment in your foundation drainage pipe, and that's what that was. And so what we believe happened in this neighborhood is that was the dominant problem. These homes were built in the 50s and 60s in this neighborhood, and through our sewer flow monitoring, rainfall monitoring, and other testing, we were able to verify that the water levels in our sewer system didn't rise high enough to flow back towards the homes. But what we believe happened was the water around the homes was unable to get to our sewer system. And we determined that by looking at groundwater monitoring. So, and looking back at what happened in August 2014, over that 2-week period in August, there were a bunch of drizzly rain events. And what it had done is we believe it had made the ground wet. And through the groundwater monitoring today, we found that even one rain event, the groundwater responded very quickly. And so our conclusion was that groundwater came up. The foundation drainage systems, because they had lost capacity over time, were unable to drain the water away fast enough. And the homeowners reported the basement walls almost being like a sponge, seeped in from everywhere, which is a foundation drainage issue.
Sorry to interrupt again. So given that case, that neighborhood, what proportion of homes were flooded again from this groundwater issue compared to the number that received protection from the infrastructure upgrade?
So I think on the worst of the 2 storm events, I think it was about 50%.
Okay.
Versus what we had in the August 19th, 2005 storm event.
Okay.
Maybe 40, 50%.
Is it possible that during the previous storms that it was groundwater in these homes, or do you think it was stormwater?
So it is possible.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So I think the fascinating part about it is, because we also sent the questionnaire to homes who didn't get flooded. So you'd have homes beside each other, look identical, same depth of basement, one flooded, one didn't. But there were a number of homes after the storm event that did do things on their homes. So some did the full relaying of the foundation drainage, so they dug around the house and redid it. Some did backflow valves. There were different scenarios, but there was a difference. And the council was very involved in this, so we ended up having a public meeting to report back these results to the residents. And at that public meeting, a number of them had put in backflow valves, and so they had chipped into their basement floor, they had the granular, and they said they could see, just on a normal sunny day, the groundwater level. So that also confirmed to us that, okay, so it's a very difficult problem to solve. Even with the foundation drainage systems working properly, with an elevated groundwater level, there's a greater chance of, and unfortunately we can't rebuild homes. And I'd say even the scary thing is the new homes that are being built tend to be built with deeper basements.
Yeah.
Do you do a lot of groundwater monitoring in the past? Like, I think that's a missing link in a lot of studies into basement flooding and such. I think groundwater gets left out a lot, and analysis of groundwater gets left out a lot.
So through the capacity assessments, they'll do what we call a desktop analysis. So they're not doing any groundwater monitoring, but they're looking at whatever records that we might have from we have some maps, or we might have some testing that was done as part of nearby construction projects. So they'll get a feeling for it being higher or lower, but that's not enough to say it's intersecting a basement or not. the challenge really is for us is, okay, let's say we find that the groundwater is high. We don't have a groundwater drainage system. So it becomes, I think the information becomes more useful to the builder and how they design their foundation, because it almost has to become more like a boat than trying to drain away the ocean. Yeah, we have a homeowner who, very, very smart, articulate person, has a repeated basement flooding at her house, beautiful house. And I'm into 3 years with her now, and she said to me, she said, now I get it. But she built the house herself. She worked with a builder to build it, and she said, I want a deeper basement. I want this. And she said she remembers the contractor saying, do you really want that? That's not what people usually do. And what she had done is she dug down so far she's intersected the groundwater, and so she has continuous problems. And she says, now I wish I'd listened to him. So climate change initiatives. So there are a number of things happening in the city on this topic. So what I've highlighted here in the bullets is different things really from council, so or derived from council. So we have a climate change action plan from 2008. There's also a climate adaptation strategy called Ahead of the Storm, Preparing Toronto for Climate Change, also in 2008. We have a resilient city topic, preparing for extreme weather events. So that started in 2013. And resilient city preparing for a changing climate in 2014. So there are a number of issues happening, and with respect to climate change, they impact all divisions in the city. And so it's being handled through this multi-divisional approach. Where they're at now, there's a working group called the Resilient City Working Group, multi-divisional, and they have 3 thematic groups that they're working on. One is transportation, utilities, and stormwater management. And this cut the stormwater management up into impacts on downtown core and impacts on other areas in the city. Their goal is to identify the various risks from different types of weather changes, pull that together, and the goal is to develop some action. So there'll be a reporting mechanism back to City Council to say, this is what we found, here's what's recommended as next steps. So we already, through the basement flooding program, have an enhanced service standard for the drainage systems. For now, we're sticking with that. Don't know what the future holds, but there are things happening. We have our wet weather flow management guidelines. So these guidelines came out of our wet weather flow master plan, and these guidelines serve as a tool for somebody, anything from an infill house to a big building, a big development, and how to manage that stormwater. So it sets a bunch of rules. So that guideline was created in 2006. So it set maximum flows you could release to our sewer system. It had water quality requirements. That's right. Okay. So we're updating that, and new ones will come out in 2016. Document will be easier to use, easier to understand, and the rules will be changing a little bit. We're also in the works. We have a Green Streets initiative that we're pulling together, creating guidelines and trying to create all those cases for when to, where to build certain things. So we're targeting a couple of things, guidelines towards the end of this year. So really the technical specifications for those different types of Green Streets measures. And also there'll be a forum in the fall of this year to try and update the public and other groups what we're doing. We're researching a stormwater charge. Many of you probably heard about stormwater charges in other municipalities. So we're in the research phase. It's not meant to bring in more revenue for us, but it's meant to be revenue neutral. But it's meant to better link the large producers of stormwater runoff with the cost of managing that runoff. So picture of Yorkdale Mall, lots of runoff. Maybe they should pay more than other people. Right now the cost is being borne by how much water you drink. So spent a couple of pressures and challenges. So for us, big pressure is the difference between public and private responsibilities. There are things happening on private property that are beyond the direct control of the municipality. So how do we reduce the risk of flooding in scenarios like that? So that's a challenge for us. Bullet number 2, how do we address flooding risks associated with groundwater? So to your question, and how do we know what it is? How do we manage it? We have to figure that out because it's not going away. Climate change, where do we draw the line between the elimination of flood risk and acceptance of flood risk? And I think that's important because we can't forever increase our service standards. There are physical limits to our roads and our space to bring in things. How do we address inflow and infiltration? So similar theme. At some point, it doesn't make sense to keep making our sewers bigger. At some point, we have to figure out how to manage or reduce the amount of water getting into them through different building practices, perhaps. The second bullet, can't build infrastructure large enough for all events. There's physical limits. Shoehorning large infrastructure. Have to remember that is a huge disruption impact to residents and businesses. So how do we verify the completed basin flooding protection projects have worked? So I spoke about post-construction flow monitoring. How do we best prioritize projects going forward? So a day doesn't go by that somebody will tell me that they feel their project is more important. We need a good set of rules. We need to be fair across the board with that. As the program accelerates, a big question in our mind is, okay, we want to spend $160 million a year. Is there enough contractors or is there enough consultants to do that without huge cost premiums? So this is a funny little slide. Maybe some people want water in their basement. Maybe they want a swimming pool. But we always have to ask ourselves, how far do we go in trying to prevent something from happening? Because there's a cost to that versus the cost you're offsetting. So on a more positive note, we've made tremendous progress. We've gone from basically $0 spent in 2008 on construction. We're at $60 million a year now. We're approaching $160 million a year. That's tremendous progress. I've got to remember it took over 100 years to build Toronto. It's going to take us decades to replace those systems that took over 100 years to build to increase that service standard. So that's really about managing expectations. Several storm events can be expected to test our system before the task is complete. So we always have to have our emergency plans in place, and we have to keep that in our mind so that we're always working as fast as we can. For success, everyone must chip in. The city, property owners, builders and developers, industry and businesses. We can fix the sewers. We need help on the building side. It's a shared responsibility. Long-term vision and commitment is needed. The city's done efforts in the past on basin flooding reduction, but they were never large enough, long enough, comprehensive enough to really fix more than 1 or 2 neighborhoods. So I think now we've done that. We've signed a contract with a consultant for many, many years, so I think we've demonstrated our commitment. And customer service, you've got to remember each story is unique. We might try and turn this into a factory, but every house is different, and we always have to remember that. So this is a famous slide when one homeowner stuck a nice poster on his garage door after we finished the work in the neighborhood, reminding us to keep up the good work and to thank us for putting in effort that we did. So with that, I'll take any questions that might be there.
Well, if there's no questions in the room, maybe I'll see if we can address some of the questions that were asked online. So we had a few questions about green infrastructure, which is kind of a trendy topic these days. Do you see a role for green infrastructure, rain gardens, infiltration features, that sort of thing, in reducing flood risk over the long term in Toronto? or how does low impact development, green infrastructure sort of factor into this program?
So there's a variety of reasons that people are wrapping their arms around green infrastructure. I think from a Toronto water perspective and the managing of flood flows, I see it as a factor in reducing, but it's an order of magnitude issue. Some of the Green Street measures might shave off a couple percent or 5% off of that flood flow impact. And I think we always have to remember that there are limits to what that green infrastructure can do. There may be places in the city, some odd places here and there, where we're able to put in larger green infrastructure that can do more, but within a given road right-of-way and putting something in the boulevard, there are limits to that for flood reduction.
Right.
In one of your slides, you showed the classic overflowing toilet in the basement, right? And but that, to me, is a clear indication of the combined sewers problem, right? And I know you've tried to address that, or you've been trying to address that. So how successful have you been, and how big of a problem is that still going forward?
So in terms of things on the horizon for us, I think it's a huge challenge for us, because I call it inflow infiltration, getting into our sanitary combined sewers, and that can be rainwater or groundwater. That flow is taking away capacity from our system. So we have a few communities where the recommendations out of our studies were so large, the ones that basically replaced every sanitary and every storm sewer in that community. So the cost, we have a threshold of $32,000 per benefiting property. The cost there was over $100,000 per property. So now we have something where we know it's bad, but we're saying it's too expensive to do. So we looped back and said, okay, we got to look at how is that water getting in. Our research so far in that neighborhood is that the entire community was built with the foundation drain systems to the sanitary sewer system. A lot of them still have their downspouts connected. So a next step is maybe improving our subsidy program. That's one option to tackle it on the private side, to reduce that inflow, try and keep more water on the road surface so it's not in the sanitary sewer and it's not coming up the washrooms. The other mechanism to it is the backflow valve. Even if it gets in our system, how can we isolate that home if it does become pressurized? It takes longer to tackle than building a new sewer in a road, because we can build a new sewer in a road within a year. Convincing enough homeowners in a neighborhood to act is years and years. So that's the challenge. It's cheaper, but it takes longer.
So are there, from what I take from that, is the combined sewer issue is beyond your price threshold, so it's not really being addressed, or you're doing these other things to try and eliminate the impact or reduce the impact. But is a combined sewer issue something that affects the entire city, or is it just specific regions?
It's a specific region. So the combined sewer system's roughly a third of the city. The separated sewer system's the other 2/3. But even in this neighborhood where they said replace everything, it was a separated sewer system. But so much rainwater was getting in the sanitary sewer, even though it wasn't planned to do that, that you could call it a combined sewer because it has so much rainwater in it. But we didn't design it that way. So we're not doing nothing. The stage we're at right now is, so we're in the middle of the study with a consultant. They're giving us a report in June of this year on that neighborhood. We need to take that and then, so one option is knock on the doors of the homes. How can we help you reconnect to the storm sewer, your foundation drainage, and the sanitary sewer? Figuring that out. I think that's the cheapest solution, most cost-effective way to do it. The most expensive way to do it is maybe we end up deciding that's not reasonable in a reasonable amount of time, and we bite the bullet and we put in the bigger sewer. But I think before we cross that line for putting in the bigger sewer, we're asking ourselves the question, does it make sense? So I don't think we've ever said that our goal is to have some neighborhoods not upgraded. We're using the financial tool today as a prioritization tool. So it's hard to know.
So on the topic of combined versus separated sewers and risk of sewer backup, I think there is sort of the perception that sewer backup risk only occurs in combined sewer areas, but you would, I think, and it was clear in your presentation, that a lot of this flooding has occurred in separated sewer areas. And when you're talking about that design standard for sanitary sewer, the 25 to 50 year return period, that is for separated sanitary sewers specifically?
That's for separated sanitary sewer.
Right. So you're assuming water is going to get into the sewer, into the separated sewer, and you want that system to be able to handle water up to the 50-year return period storm without backing up into basements. Is that basically it?
That's correct. So when the sewers originally built, they were more or less just designed for groundwater inflow. But bringing in that May 2000 storm said a storm event of this much, that much rainwater, getting into the sanitary sewer system, we want it big enough to handle that.
Right.
But we have some trade-offs. Some of our treatment plants can't handle a lot more water. So when we make those sanitary sewers bigger, it's dumping that water downstream. It's kicking the can downstream. And the upgrade costs at our treatment plants are either not possible or tremendously even more expensive. So which then circles us back to we've got to figure out how to do this on not having the water get in. So we're looking at all those connection points, which is time consuming, but it's the better way to do it.
What about foundation drains to sanitary? Still a big problem in Toronto?
So it's funny. So it was a common building practice through that area, but in some neighborhoods we're not monitoring as much inflow, and some neighborhoods we're monitoring a mountain of inflow. So it's select neighborhoods that I'd say it is a big problem, but other neighborhoods, for reasons I can't really explain, it's not as big a problem. Maybe it's the groundwater differences in that one neighborhood versus another is higher or lower. It's hard to know.
So there's been a few questions on the groundwater issue and also on planning. So one of the things that I've sort of been thinking about is the maybe a bit of a divergence in terms of goals of land use planning versus basement flood risk reduction. So one of you were mentioning there's a requirement for sort of the allowable amount of a lot that you can develop and make impermeable or whatever. So you want a bigger lot so you can drain your stormwater onto the lot and don't have to have things connected into the system. And also, you know, the level of the basement floor is a factor as well. But generally in the land use planning community, we're trying to create denser development, and we're trying to, as part of that increase in densification, is facilitating finishing of basements. And I noted in the 2012 Ontario Building Code, they increased the allowable height of a basement wall from 8 feet to 9 feet before it has to be engineered with the idea of, you know, creating basements that are more livable with bigger windows and that sort of thing. Is there any discussion about that topic? Am I right? Is there a bit of a competition in terms of goals? Is that something that's discussed at all?
So without a doubt, there's some competing challenges. I mentioned coordination. There's this stormwater management steering committee that's being formed. So the planning group sits there, Toronto Water sits there, the building division sits there. That's a place for us to talk about these kinds of things. I find it a big challenge. So I find I'll just use reverse slope driveways as an example. It's there to reduce risk, and what do we have? We have builders come and challenge us through our committee of adjustment process, or maybe even the Ontario Municipal Board, saying, no, I need this. So Toronto Water's tools, in a sense, are limited. We're not a planning group, so the Planning Act, it's hard for us to stick our fingers into it. The way we have done it on reverse slope driveways is we've worked with the planning division. In their bylaw, they put in wording to ban that. In our bylaw, in the Toronto Water portion of the bylaw, the sewerage bylaw, we then have added the part about an indemnification agreement. We said, okay, clearly we're not going to stop you from taking on this risk, but here, we're going to advise you that you are taking on this risk. We are not. So there's a legal agreement that gets signed to put a title for the property saying, you built that, you can't come after the city for your damages as a result of building that. So yeah, there's competing forces, and at the end of the day, we have that portion in our bylaw because we realized we can't stop everybody. I think maybe through education and whatnot, we can encourage some people to recognize where they're building and build better. Another component of one of the things we're working on is groundwater is a problem for us, especially. I'll use the word cheaters if my director doesn't stop me. There's cheaters. So whereby, you know, a development might say they're going to throw 1 liter per second of groundwater into our sewer, and you know, we turn around a year later and what are you doing putting 1,000 liters per second in? So how do we manage that? So we are working on something to have more enforcement, more monitoring of those flows, and also have a cost recovery component with it. So maybe we can't stop it from happening, but maybe we can collect the monies. If you really want to give us that much water, then we can have our sewer system and treatment systems funded to manage that.
Also, on the topic of groundwater, there's a few questions online, and we talked about it in the office a fair bit. It's not, you know, when you think about basement flooding, you think about I&I and stormwater, and a lot of people don't think about groundwater, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of regulation in terms of, you know, limiting development in areas where the groundwater table is high. Is there anything like, you know, zoning to control development in high groundwater areas not being considered? You don't know if it's being considered by anybody,
or at least not allowing a basement,
or at least, yeah, some remediative measures like increasing the height of the basement floor or not allowing basements. Any thoughts on that?
So I think some improvements to our process are needed. I don't think it's reasonable to expect a planner in the planning division to all of a sudden become an engineer and comment on this. That being said, they can have certain things built into their process, but I think there are a few points in the process whereby there's a way for us to influence that. So from a Toronto Water perspective, you can only connect to our sewer if we let you. So that's really our teeth. If you are doing something silly with what you want to discharge, whether it's too dirty or you know, where are you getting that water from? We have the means to intervene because ultimately they want a connection. Otherwise, they can't build their building, and so we have some influence at that point. So I think through what we're trying to build with respect to cost recovery and monitoring and enforcement on groundwater, we'll be able to do more.
Okay.
And so I think hopefully 2016 is we're rolling out with something on that. Okay. We've always had clauses in our bylaw, but it's more about, okay, we've got to make it front and center.
Right. Okay. Well, we're pretty much up to our time limit here. It's 11:28. There was a couple of questions about accessing the resources, some of the resources that David mentioned in the presentation. So, for example, the map of the EA study areas that's on the basement flooding website for City of Toronto, which I think you can just Google City of Toronto basement flooding and you'll find that.
Yes.
And your email address is up there. Some people said, can we contact David with questions after? So hopefully that's okay.
Most definitely.
Yep, okay. And we will be posting, with David's approval, the recording of the presentation and slides on our website. All of our presentations for Friday Forums are posted on our YouTube site, which you can find by going to our website, ICLR.org, and then clicking on the YouTube link. So that'll be up probably mid-next week at the latest. And with that, I'll remind you that we have another presentation coming up with Professor Simonovich from Western University on March 11th on the topic of climate change and flood management. And I'd like to thank David and Grant for coming in to the office this morning and everybody for joining online. And we'll see you again in March. And with that, that concludes the webinar.